also fax machines. The brethren have long maintained that fax machines, mobile phones, computers and other electronic conveniences are tools of the devil. The man of sin will use such devices to communicate instantaneously with the deceived masses. We were puzzled about conflicting statements about this issue, and my wife was ready to bark. She phoned Bruce Hales, who was taking calls for his father, to ask his opinion. Bruce's answer was evasive, not the sort of response you would expect from a would-be universal leader. All he would say was that we must go by what these great men have said, and beat a hasty retreat by suggesting that I speak to his father-in-law, Athol Green, the leader of the neighbouring assembly, Penrith, who was older and wiser than he, so older and wiser than Bruce. Well, I think we probably knew that, although I heard that Athol Green died at the time of COVID and he was not really too well looked after or cared for, but that's only what I've heard. Of course, that would be very serious because he came right through the 60s, 70s. He was there. I remember him meeting and being at the front row, participating in meetings in Guildford with the JHS in the 70s, and he's come right through. But maybe he saw the light at the end of his life. I don't know. Maybe he could see that Bruce wasn't the real Paul of our day, the real man of God. I don't know, but I'm just surmising because Athol had a longer history than Bruce, and Bruce admitted that he was older and wiser than he. After several days, I spoke to Athol Green, who had been forewarned by Bruce. He explained that the fax machine was just part of the build-up of the present electronic age, which you should at all costs avoid, and that besides, he objected to receiving communications on an onion skin. He also gave a list of references about fax machines in JSH's ministry. After reading the ministry references of JSH, I was more confused than ever. JSH said that we didn't use fax machines because we didn't need them. They were a worldly notion that the man of sin would use them to communicate instantaneously. I explained to Athol Green that the previous list of Leicester invites had been faxed all over the country. He told me that he did not know who had given permission to fax the Leicester list, but I did. It was faxed from Hypec ITS, the Technology Service Centre next door to Bruce Hales' business premises at Ryde. So, in June 2003, I'm moving on, sorry. Bruce said in Perth in 2002, July, you know, surely they'll let us have a fax machine, finally. Never. That's the answer to that one, never. Does anyone disagree with that? I'd rather someone speak up and let's have a look at it and examine it. Anyone in business knows it's a speaking metaphorically, it's a pain in the neck to have to go next door to send a fax. But just imagine if fax machines were allowed among the brethren. Every phone in every home would be a fax machine. Imagine the chaos universally. Imagine the correspondence. Imagine the paperwork. Imagine the defilement that would be the devil would introduce. And then under the subject of mobile phones, he said in a reading in New York in June 2002, now it's these other little things you can hold in your hand, and they're a direct link with the world. See? If we have a link with them, if we're going on with them, really we've no link with Christianity. Essentially, we've got no link with Christianity. What JT said about the radio, it was a test of fellowship. He said it was a pipeline of filth into the believer's house. And these mobile things, it's the same thing. They're just a straight pipeline of filth. And it's a test of fellowship, a clear test of fellowship. The strange thing is that brethren are allowed to tap into these pipelines of filth whenever they please, as they have no conscience about calling persons on their mobile phones. Russell says Bruce's stand in relation to mobile phones is an insult to the myriads of Christians worldwide who use this method as their only or preferred method of communication, without any second thought that it might be a tool of the devil. It is basically unchristianizing anybody who uses a mobile phone. He says we don't want to unchristianize anybody, but that is exactly what he is doing. And then we move on to the subject of relocation. In June 2003, Bruce decided to set up relocation commissions in every locality to control the migration, but for some places it was too late. In Windsor, for example, at least 9 households have been given approval by Bruce to move. And when the 3-man commissions were set up, he had nothing to do because there's no more scope for relocation. In many cases, Bruce overrode local feelings and directed families to move as it suited him. In the JSH era, the Brethren abandoned Asia and Africa altogether, giving the lie to the claim that they are indeed the church, the only true universal position. Goulburn brothers have told me that they carry on the long-established custom of street preaching, which is mainly shunned now by the younger generation. But I've never observed this in the 18 months I have lived in Goulburn, nor have other local Christians with whom I associate. Money-making has overtaken the service of God and the testimony as the chief objective of the Brethren this side of eternity. The Brethren have certainly impressed the locals with their big new factories, meeting rooms and house extensions, but not much more. The Laodicean Christians would have impressed the townsfolk with their material success. The Brethren have grown rich and are in need of nothing, satisfied that a link with the elect vessel is all that is required to secure their eternal destiny. Indeed, Bruce Hales said in a preaching in Katoomba soon after his inauguration, I've often thought in my experience that we're never really going to be ever closer to Christ than we've been to these great men. You say, well, what do you mean? When we get to heaven, surely we'll be closer to Christ. I don't think so. I don't think so. So there you have it. Your link with Bruce is your ticket to heaven, as he is the only great man alive now. But just make sure you're well cashed up, because your link with Bruce Hales will be much stronger if you can contribute financially to meeting rooms, schools, election campaigns, etc. And then the subject of the review. When Bruce first took over from his father, the changeover was likened to the transfer from Elijah to Elisha, and Bruce's ministry was going to usher in a dispensation of grace. This would keep the young people happy who had found the JSH era stodgy and boring. The review was initiated as a brilliant demonstration of this dispensation of grace, because not only would it establish Bruce's position as a champion of the wronged, but the Brethren numbers would miraculously increase. It wasn't long before assembly judgments were being reviewed all over the world, covering both the JHS and JSH eras. This was an opportunity to get rid of the local leaders who had been in charge during these periods and install BDH toadies who wouldn't be a threat to Bruce's ambitions. JHS and JSH were no longer around to answer any charges, and it was easy to say that a wrong judgment had been made because the facts had been misrepresented to the elect vessel, or that his pronouncement had been misinterpreted. Misinterpretation means misrepresentation became the catchery. I just could not understand the one-size-fits-all mentality that pervaded, where every matter had to be reviewed and judgments reversed because it was the thing to do, in the vain hope that persons would return to the fold. The fact remains that the review temporarily bent the rules to accommodate the current programme. Although a few outs took advantage of the amnesty to come back to the Brethren, to be cared for by their relatives or pick up the lucrative deals that were being made, by and large the review has been a dismal failure. All that has been left is a festering legacy of broken hearts, wounded souls and hurt feelings, as ex-Brethren come to grips with the stark reality of the broken marriages that need not have been, the children lost in the stranglehold of Brethrenism, and the short-lived moratorium of compromise, which reopened healed wounds and gave a false glimmer of hope to those cut off from their loved ones. The Laodicean door seemed to open just a little, but now to slam shut forever. To add insult to injury, Bruce Hales said recently that if persons out of fellowship refuse to come back to the Brethren after having their matters reviewed and the assembly judgments reversed, it's questionable if they are saved. He must be desperate. there were, of course, plenty of skeletons in the cupboard, which Bruce Hales wasn't prepared to bring out of the cupboard. Take, for example, the case of Malcolm John from Windsor, who died a few years ago. Malcolm was withdrawn from in the JHS era for compromise in business with a person who had once been in fellowship, a capital sin in those days. Although he had confessed his guilt and was repentant, nevertheless he had to accept the extreme penalty, as this was the pronouncement from JHS. But now his family were baying for blood in the hope that at least the poor man would be vindicated at the judgment seat. Surely what he had done was minor compared to matters already reviewed, where even outstanding moral issues are swept under the carpet in the excitement to get people back. The Assembly judgment was reversed, but Malcolm may have to wait a little longer to hear the good news, because apparently Bruce had said that the rapture may be a little bit longer in coming than we thought, now that George Bush and John Howard were back in government. Then there's the case of Colin Williams from Windsor, the founding father who found himself trying to stave off attacks from Colin Coote and Alf Woodbury, who both wanted his job. They got him withdrawn from over some obscure trumped-up charges relating to a Brethren business in Campbelltown. The poor man had to hand over his business to his son and live like a hermit for a number of years until he had done the necessary penance. Brethren maintain that the review does not in any way cast a doubt on the ministry of the previous elect vessels, who could do no wrong, even though Brethren were told and the universal leader at the time had expressed his judgment and that priests were acting on this council. Apparently the priests were guilty of misinterpretation of the leader's words or misrepresentation of the facts, or both. But persons who have been wronged will not swallow this baloney, knowing full well how JHS or JSH expressed themselves at the time, and that the priests were only doing what they were told. How so many responsible men from so many localities over such a long period of time could misrepresent the facts or misunderstand or misinterpret what they were told belies belief. And so on and so forth. Bruce seemed to find it necessary to reenact the proceedings of October 1987, when the Brethren in Sydney reversed the withdrawal actions of 1976 and 1979 in relation to his father. In a letter Bruce wrote to me in January 2004, he stated, "It has become abundantly clear through extensive open confession and acknowledgement that his reinstatement was only partial in the minds of many brethren." And then listen to this. Anybody acquainted with the history of Sydney during the years 1976 to 1984 will know that Bruce was prominent and had significant contact with JHS. He was invited to the memorable Universal 3-day meetings in Winnipeg in 1982 as one of the handful of representatives from Sydney, and had to come back and dispose of his computer as directed in those meetings. I mean, I remember, so Bruce Hales, I understand, went to the Universal meetings from 1982 onwards, and I asked the brethren who'd been excommunicated in the Winnipeg area why that was, and they said, oh, because he had a judgment of the commercial system. That's why the Winnipeg and Netchi brethren invited Bruce Hales, because he had a judgment of the commercial system. So I've picked up a few facts as I've gone around the world. Very few brethren could afford computers in those days, and Bruce's peers had to just stand back and look on with envy as this young man in his 20s gathered wealth and fame amongst the brethren, with his father out of the way. JSH had to be content to peer through the crack in the fence as his son flashed past in his Volvo on his way from Concord to Ermington with his family. Since his father's death, Bruce has been vehement in his castigation of the brethren for their treatment of his father, claiming that the brethren in Sydney hated him for 50 years and that he would be a lot further ahead if we had listened to him, but all the while distancing himself from involvement. To quote one of his henchmen in Penrith, Bruce's ministry has always been distinctive, so it wouldn't be appropriate to suggest that he made any mistakes, would it? To quote Bruce's letter to me again, he said about his sitting on the fence when his father was withdrawn from, "This stand did not contradict my doubts as to what was proceeding in Assembly in Sydney during that period. However, I never entertained a single doubt as to JHS's integrity, fatherhood and friendship, all of which I had been acquainted with since 1964. Not one doubt about JHS from 1964. Wow. Is Bruce being honest? The rank and file amongst the brethren genuinely believed that JSH was withdrawn from under directions from JHS, and Bruce made no attempt to alter this opinion, giving the impression that he was in full support of his brethren in Sydney. After all, JSH was one of many prominent men who succumbed to the axe for their supposed disrespect for the elect vessel. It wasn't until after the death of JHS that the wheels were set in motion to reinstate JSH to his former glory. And it is significant to note that the printed summary of the meetings in 1987, when the Assembly judgments were reversed, makes no reference to JHS's pronouncements. It also is significant to note that JHS said to Bruce's father-in-law Athol Green in Bristol 1979, "Your daughters thought they had made it when they married Haleses, didn't they? Honestly, oh dear. You'll have to scrape up all the hailstones and damp them down the drain and start over again. You know that? That's what you'll have to do, Athol." He phoned me, not Bill, the other guy, like to move to Australia. Like to move to Australia. You know what I told him? "I can't tell you. Please, please, Ross Hales, keep out of America. We've got all the troubles we can stand already." That was JSHS, volume 54, page 49. So keep out of America, Ross.